Hello, my name is Connor Sweeney, and I'm currently a Life Scout with Troop 12, Pleasantville, New York. I led the creation of this audio tour as an Eagle Scout service project designed to make history more accessible to my hometown and community. Please take a moment and make certain your earbuds or headphones are secure and that you can hear my voice clearly. This tour was designed to run roughly 60 minutes, but you should feel free to press pause at any time and extend your tour. Please take note of this sound. When you hear this sound, the tour will be stopping at a specific point of interest. To keep pace with the tour, you'll want to listen to our narrator's instructions before advancing to the next point of interest. I'll return at the end of our journey to thank some of the Pleasantville community members who have given their time and support to this project. Our first narrator will share a few more details with you before beginning the tour at the front of the old railroad building on Wheeler Avenue. Thank you, and enjoy your tour.
Hello, and welcome to our historic audio tour of Pleasantville, New York. Whether you plan to walk a few blocks with us or complete the entire tour, we appreciate you lending us your ears for this trip back in time. You now stand near the very center of the village of Pleasantville, or what would become the center once the New York Central and Harlem Railroad arrived in roughly 1847. The arrival of the railroad arguably shaped modern-day Pleasantville more than any other single event. You'll be hearing more about the railroad's arrival along with stories about people, families, and the local economic ebb and flow. But first, let me mention that the voices guiding you back in time on this tour are all members of today's Pleasantville community. We'll share their identities with you at the very end of our tour. Also, the content of this audio tour was created using information and writings from a number of published books that have carefully detailed Pleasantville's history. You'll find at the end of this recording a complete listing of these historic texts and footnotes for each of the passages. This audio tour was created to accompany you on a 1-mile walk across Pleasantville and will conclude in the Old Village, or what was once known as Clark's Corners. Along the way, we'll point out certain historical homes and buildings and try and give you a sense of the everyday lives of Pleasantville citizens from days long past. Now, let's get our bearings. The railroad will serve as a useful compass. Note, the tracks run south and north at the very center of the town, and our tour begins just east of the tracks beside the Stone Railroad station. Our tour will move south on Wheeler Avenue, but for a moment, please look north toward the intersection of Wheeler Avenue and Manville Road, one of Pleasantville's most historic, rich, and energetic crossways. It was here where the Stone train station originally stood. The station was moved to its current location after the railroad tracks were lowered in the early 1960s. Sterling Silvernail, the railroad guard at the Manville Road crossing at the time, told the New York Times that he would lose his job when the new Manville overpass was opened, but he added he was at retirement age and he would still have his hobby of embroidering to keep him busy. For his part, Mr. Silvernail monitored and oversaw a grade crossing barrier that halted traffic in both directions on Manville Road whenever a train passed through the village. The sounds of railroad crossing bells and lines of cars with their engines humming were part of the Pleasantville experience for most of the first half of the 20th century. As the lines of cars stretched up Manville, drivers would wave to friends and visitors who sat on the wide-open porches of two popular hotels that were located only yards from the crossing. Huff's Hotel, built in the 1890s on the corner of Washington Avenue and Manville Road, the site of the Dunkin' Donuts, and Conlon's Hotel, located on the west side of Wheeler Avenue, facing what was known as Depot Square. New Yorkers would frequently escape to these hotels for the weekend to enjoy the country air as well as the celebrated Lion Brewery Pilsner on tap at Conlon's. For its part, the Huff Hotel is reported to have installed the first telephone in the village. This is the first of many snapshots we hope to share with you along our tour, which begins here on Wheeler and will end in the Old Village, or what had at one time been known as Clark's Corners, an area roughly a mile east from where you now stand. Prior to the arrival of the railroad, the area where you are now standing was largely populated with apple orchards. However, agile land speculators arrived alongside the hefty locomotives and played an important part in the conversion of Pleasantville from a farming village to a suburb. One notable land speculator was a New York City businessman, Samuel Shapter, who married the sister of Moses Pierce, one of Pleasantville's most esteemed historical figures. We'll tell you more about Moses later on the tour. For his part, Shapter bought up a number of Pleasantville lots and subdivided them into smaller 75, 50, and 25-foot plots. He then sold them to different enterprising families and individuals who collectively converted the apple orchards into the center of commerce known as Wheeler Avenue today. Our next stop on the tour will be the northwest corner of Wheeler and Bedford Road. Please meet us there. Meanwhile, as we walk, we'll share with you a passage from one of our featured historic texts. Passage 1. The Community. After the arrival of the railroad in 1847, the village experienced an increased interest in land speculation. In the late 1800s, there was still many large tracts of farmlands to be found. However, the continued influx of early commuters resulted in the dividing up of the farms into smaller parcels of land that would soon occupy homes. At the time, the village was divided into two zones, residence and business. However, a growing building boom created a need for regulations, so a zoning ordinance was written in 1926. The new ordinance divided Pleasantville into three distinct areas: the business district, which consisted of the immediate streets around the railroad station, the residential district, and finally, on the outer area of the village, what was known as the farm estates. Considerable development took place during the 1920s and the 1930s, and much of what was built during those decades still exists today. End of passage. You should now be standing on the northwest corner of Wheeler and Bedford Road. Beside you is the building that currently houses Pleasantville's Village Hall and Police Department. However, for many years, this building was home to Mount Pleasant Bank, the village's first financial institution, opened in 1904 with capital of $25,000 and a surplus of $5,000. Diagonally opposite the Mount Pleasant Bank was the First National Bank of Pleasantville, a building many people credit with helping make Pleasantville known across the country. In 1923, Reader's Digest set up its offices above the First National Bank and also occupied space in the Mount Pleasant Bank. Over the next 16 years, the workforce of Reader's Digest would grow to more than 700 employees, a subpopulation that energized the village's downtown. To accommodate the workforce, 2 floors and an elevator were added to the First National Bank building. Meanwhile, the publishing house's swelling volumes of mail led the Pleasantville Post Office to search for more space, which it soon found inside the former Conlins Hotel on Manville Road. As things grew ever more crowded, the publishing house opted to leave Pleasantville in 1939 for more expansive headquarters in Chappaqua. However, preferring the tranquility its Pleasantville mailing address appeared to convey, the publisher arranged to keep a Pleasantville address with the help of postal officials. Let's now continue our tour up Bedford Road, due east, to the Old Village. Until 1895, this portion of Bedford Road was named Railroad Avenue, in light of it being the main artery between the Old Village and the railroad. As passenger traffic, commercial deliveries, and mail gravitated from Pleasantville's old world to its new world, where you are currently standing. Our next stop will be 415 Bedford Road, known as Marmaduke Foster House. For the purposes of this tour, please walk on the sidewalk on the north side of Bedford Road. Meanwhile, as we walk, we will share a few facts from our history texts about Pleasantville's early inhabitants. Passage number 2. The Native Americans and the Dutch. The earliest known inhabitants of Pleasantville were known as Wekuwsek. The word Wekuwsek is believed to mean the open land around our home. And together, we're now advancing down one of their oldest trails, named Sukkabonk, or what we call Bedford Road. The subsequent arrival of the Dutch and the establishment of New Amsterdam coincided within years of such other New World settlements as Plymouth and Jamestown. However, New Amsterdam differed from these settlements because rather than make colonization a priority, the Dutch set up a series of elite manors to facilitate trade and fuel their economic engine. Phillipsburg Manor, Upper Mills, only a few miles west of Pleasantville, was an enterprising example of the Dutch settlement system, and so it was in 1695 when one of the manor's tenant families by the name of C settled in Pleasantville. The C family included Isaac and Esther C, along with their son Isaac and his wife Maria. The C's would remain dependent on the Indian Trail for trade and weekly church services. While the specific terms of C's lease is unknown, the tenants' lands spreads across 169 acres. The original C farmhouse was located further west near the old village. End of passage. We should now be standing in front of 415 Bedford Road, known as the Marmaduke Foster House, named after the man who built it in 1786, after purchasing 220 acres, an area that spanned from present-day Bedford Road and Orchard Street all the way west to the Sawmill River Parkway. Now, Mr. Foster's purchase is worth exploring more deeply because he acquired the land from what was known as the Commissioners of Forfeiture. First, some background information. In the year of 1779, the New York State Assembly passed an act permitting the confiscation of land of any and all loyalists to the British Crown. The Phillips family of Phillipsburg Manor, to whom the C family had been paying rent to for over 80 years, were known loyalists and subsequently were required to forfeit their lands and property to the Commissioners of Forfeiture. Fortunately, for the C's and other tenant families, the state decreed that those community members who had endeavored to defend and fight for freedom and independence could remain in possession of their current rental agreements, but were given the first option to buy their farms minus the price of any improvements that were made under their care. James and Isaac C. purchased the farm occupied by their father in 1785. Over the next 50 years, it would be divided from the original 168 acres downward in small parcels. For their part, both of the brothers were reported to have actively participated in the Revolutionary War effort. As for Marmaduke Forster, he lived in the house he had built until his death in 1825. Following his death, in 1830, the house and 100 acres was sold to Henry Hobby, who lived there until 1869, when he would sell the house and farm to Samuel Shapter, who, thanks to the arrival of the railroad, had become one of the area's most agile land speculators. Let's now walk and view the house next door at 405 Bedford Road, known as the Albert C. home. Albert C. was a descendant of Isaac's, and while he was general manager of Cornell's Fuel and Lumber Company, located west of the railroad tracks, he reportedly selected the Queen Anne-style home from Schoppel's Modern Houses in the late 1800s, and sourced the required lumber directly from his place of labor. Besides his unique ancestry and involvement in village affairs, Mr. C. may be worthy of note, having reportedly been the first Pleasantville citizen to own an automobile.
Now, before we continue our walk, please notice the large stained glass window featured on the front of the Presbyterian Church directly across on the south side of the street at 400 Bedford. The cornerstone of this church was laid on November 2nd, 1880. We'll be sharing with you some of the history of Pleasantville's houses of worship later on this tour, but permit me to share one last item about the Reader's Digest relationship. Among the notable occasions celebrated at the Presbyterian Church was the 1922 marriage of the founders of Reader's Digest, DeWitt Wallace and Lila Bell Atkinson. By 1936, the Wallaces were renting 14 different Pleasantville properties. Parking across the village became scarce. Reluctant to allow a fast-growing commercial business to alter the village's commercial residential makeup, Pleasantville's village officials rejected DeWitt Wallace's request to build a substantial headquarters inside the village. "You will live to regret this day," he is reported to have told village leaders. Wallace's words may be worth reflecting on as we continue our walk and learn more about some of the civic leaders who helped to shape the village and at times resist the forces of fortune. Looking back, it's hard not to notice a striking resemblance between the depiction of American life within the pages of Reader's Digest and the everyday goings-on along Bedford Road, a roadway that no doubt held special meaning for the Wallaces. In the minds of many Americans, the Wallaces magazine sought to preserve a period in American life that was quickly fleeing. It was a goal shared in common with the village leaders who ultimately rejected DeWitt's proposal. Our tour will now continue up Bedford Road to 375, the William Reynolds House. We're now standing in front of the William Reynolds House at 375 Bedford Road. William Reynolds was one of two pickle manufacturers in Pleasantville in the late 1800s. His house sat on a 4-acre lot and hosted 4 square pickle vats. The business prospered until Reynolds was robbed while making a large deposit in the village of Sing Sing, which today is known as Ossining, explains village historian Karsten Johnson. Now, before we continue our walk, please look across Bedford Road to the south side of the street and set your eyes upon the stone facade of St. John's Episcopal Church. Please take note of the White House that shares the block with St. John's. Built in 1785, the residence at 378 Bedford Road at one time served as St. John's Rectory and is reported to be the oldest house in Pleasantville.
Passage, 378 Bedford Road, Forster Earl Homestead. This is the only remaining tenant farmhouse within the village built before the American Revolution. Although it was built in approximately 1725, the larger section of the house was built by John Forster around 1815. Forster retired from a merchant career and came to Pleasantville to farm. He bought the 100-acre farm from his father, Marmaduke Forster. In about 1860, Daniel D. Earl bought the house and farm. Earl owned the house until his death in 1900. Although he left school at the age of 12 to work for importers in New York City, Earl became a partner in the firm of B.L. Solomon & Sons, interior decorators. He was a Republican and attended the Presbyterian Church. Earl put up the first street lamp in Pleasantville in front of this house in the 1870s. Caroline Choate owned the house after Earl, buying it around 1929. She changed it from a farmhouse with no plumbing or electricity to a modern suburban house.
Let's now continue our walk to the corner of Bedford Road and Great Oaks Lane. The Red Brick Girl Scouts headquarters, on your left, occupies a lot that is significant for having been the address for not one but 2 generations of one of Pleasantville's founding families. Henry Romer, born in 1794, was a popular civic leader and businessman who, on February 29, 1828, was appointed the village's first postmaster. We'll be sharing more with you about Henry Romer as we approach the old village where Romer's business was. His son, Alfred Romer, would build a house on this lot in 1878 after his father's house burned down in 1869. As the son of the town's first postmaster, Alfred's professional and home life is notable because it revealed the possibilities of the railroad era when Pleasantville citizens began integrating their small-town lives with big city careers. For his part, college-educated Alfred became an officer and director of the Williamsburg Savings Bank, and later, using his banking connections and experience, he helped to establish the Mount Pleasant Savings Bank at the corner of Wheeler and Bedford. A familiar figure on Alfred's property was Joseph Green, a former slave, according to village historian Karsten Johnson. Green, who arrived in Pleasantville sometime after the Civil War, maintained the Romers' farming operations. Green raised his family nearby and would frequently be tasked with driving Alfred, a pioneering commuter, back from the train station in the Romers' Pullman motor car. In the early 1900s, most local citizens still relied on a horse for transportation, and homes did not yet have running water. So people pumped water from backyard wells until water mains were installed around 1911. In the early part of the century, Pleasantville had no electricity, and like the prior century, relied on kerosene to provide light. At night, a village lamplighter was deployed to light kerosene street lamps. Please cross Great Oaks Lane, and our tour will begin again in front of the private home with the large octagonal dome on the adjacent corner. You are now standing in front of Pleasantville's old library hall, recently renovated as a private home. Built in 1896, the building was Pleasantville's first permanent library, and it was also used as a theater and an assembly hall.
Passage, 359 Bedford Road. Built in the shingle style around 1895, the old recreation center was designed by John W. Robinson. The first floor served as an auditorium, reading room, social room, and library. The auditorium has a domed ceiling in an octagonal shape. The basement had a bowling alley and a billiard room, as well as dressing rooms for the theater. A few weeks after opening, the Ideal Stock Company of Brooklyn put on a love knot to raise money for stage curtains and scenery. Officers of the Library Association included such leading citizens as S. Wood Cornell, G. H. Wheeler, Albert C., Daniel P. Hayes, Alfred Romer, and Thomas B. Pierce. It is an example of the rapid advancement of Pleasantville into the early 20th century. In 1923, the village of Pleasantville took over the building, and it was used as the library. In 1967, the new library opened at its current location at 350 Bedford Road. This building, known as the Pleasantville Library Hall, was used until recently as the Village Recreation Center. End of passage.
Now, let's begin our walk once again. As you're by now well aware, we are walking down the north side of Bedford Road. However, we will be making a stop at the Mount Pleasant Library on the south side of Bedford. As we continue our walk, a painted crosswalk will soon appear just west of Orchard Street. Please use this crosswalk, and we'll meet again at the library's entrance. You may recall the name of Samuel Shapter, whom we have mentioned in relation to land speculation, as well as his marriage to the sister of Moses Pierce, a person who has recently led historians to delve deep into Pleasantville history and its maze of entangled family names. The roots of the Pierces run deep across the village. When we arrive at the library, please find the plaque near the entrance that is dedicated to Moses and his wife, Esther, whose Pleasantville home served as a primary connection inside Westchester County's Underground Railroad. Our tour will begin again shortly in front of the Mount Pleasant Library. Hello and welcome to the Mount Pleasant Library. Before we continue our walk down Bedford, here are some remarks made by Lawrence Otis Graham, a noted attorney and author who spoke at this very spot during a 2012 ceremony to honor Moses and Esther.
Thank you very much. Thank you all of you for coming out this morning, and I want to congratulate Dorothy on this incredible research that she's performed and also on bringing attention not just to the history of Pleasantville, the history of Mount Pleasant, but also national history. And this is national history here because this Moses Pierce and his wife were not just doing something that appears now to be courageous. It was a dangerous act, where these Southerners were saying, if you find X person who was a slave still owned by me in South Carolina and Virginia, your duty is to return them. Moses Pierce and his colleagues and friends and neighbors here in Mount Pleasant did something beyond that. They aggressively opened up their homes, opened up their churches, opened up their private lives to bring these strangers that they didn't know, that they had no ties to. There was no financial advantage to doing this. There was no social advantage to doing this because they certainly would have been ostracized by their neighbors. And they did the courageous things that we want all of our neighbors today to be willing to do, is to go the extra mile, to make that extra step, to say what is morally right for us to do as citizens, and that is to treat people equally and to reach out for those that are less advantaged than we are. And what's so important right now is that this is not just a monument for what Moses Pierce did over 100 years ago. It's a reminder for what we need to be doing today as residents here in Mount Pleasant, to say, let's look out and see what other people out there, even today, are less advantaged to us, and what do we have, what's our moral responsibility to reach out to them, to support them. It's not just writing a check, it's also reaching out and volunteering our time. And this should be a monument to remind all of us as we enter Mount Pleasant Library, as we visit Pleasantville, to know that there are courageous people that lived here over 100 years ago in the person of Moses Pierce, but also that we ourselves have that same responsibility.
We'll now continue our tour and cross back to Bedford Road's north side. As we cross, you'll want to quickly look down Romer Avenue beside the library and spot Pleasantville High School, which sits at the very end of Romer. The high school was completed in 1930 on land that had previously been used as a village recreational center. The cost of construction was $500,000. Please look across the street at the large yellow house on the corner of Bedford and Romer Avenue. Passage, 334 Bedford Road, the Joseph R. Banks House. Built for Joseph R. Banks in 1874, this house is a symbol of the spirit and cycle of increasing prosperity that came to metropolitan areas after railroads made an agrarian merchant economy possible. It is built in the style of Second Empire, which is characterized by mansard roofs. Joseph R. Banks was a son-in-law of Henry Romer. After he died, Catherine Field bought the house from Alfred Romer. She operated a girls' finishing school in the house where girls could go to polish their grammar school education. Field sold the property in 1903 to Henry L. Hunter, whose wife wanted the house modernized. In 1911, plumbing and electricity were installed, as well as full-size dining room and new kitchen complete with a laundry room and butler's pantry. The Hunters rented out the house in the early 1920s. One tenant operated Broadlawn, a high-tone boarding house and tea room. The Hunters resumed permanent residence in 1925. End of passage. Our next stop on the tour will be the Bedford Road School. As the Bedford Road School comes into view, we have another page from a history text to share with you.
Passage Community School. The first public schoolhouse in Pleasantville was a two-story structure that opened in 1826 at Broadway and Church Street, not far from Pleasantville's first church. The site of Pleasantville School was shifted in 1875 so it could be in a more central location. A new school was erected on the grounds where Bedford Road School now stands. The school housed a grammar school with the primary grades on the first floor and the upper grades on the second floor. Children in the lower grades had to enter the school through a back door, while the upper grades went through the front door. Pleasantville's first graduating class consisted of 2 students. In response to the growing population, the Roselle Avenue School was built in 1923 to house kindergarten through 4th grade. This helped to relieve the overcrowding at the Bedford Road School to some extent. However, school officials were still forced to have students attend classes on a double shift because of the large numbers. Ironically, the Roselle Avenue School closed in 1977 in response to a decline in student enrollment. Finally, in 1928, an education study was done by the Teachers College at Columbia University as part of the Need for Further Schools Association of Pleasantville. It was recommended that Pleasantville build a new high school as well as a junior high. End of passage.
As we pass the new Bedford Road School, originally built in 1909, please pause for a moment in front of the World War I memorial that lists those Pleasantville citizens who died in that war. Along our walk today, you have heard the names C., Romer, and Pierce, and as we now make our way to the Old Village, the names Clark and Hayes will be added to our list of founding families. However, the names listed on this memorial are seldom spoken except on Memorial Day when the Indian Trail, Succobank, becomes a parade path that begins beside this memorial and ends at Pleasantville's Memorial Plaza alongside the railroad. In June of 1941, a few dozen young men posed for a photo beside the stone station where our tour began. Together they boarded a southbound train to New York City, where they reported to an induction bureau of the armed services and were swiftly inducted. As we continue our walk to the Old Village, you'll hear some of the names of the people listed on this memorial, as well as others who were lost in other wars. They once walked down this road and perhaps grew up on it or beside it. While the C's fought for independence and the Pierces fought against slavery, no family paid a higher price for freedom and the splendors it afforded Pleasantville than those whose family members never returned
Robert
home.
S. Fowler, Victor Gabrielli, Donald Haight, Charles.
Our tour will now continue down Bedford Road for a number of blocks. Here again is our narrator.
Like any road that originated from a footpath, the Succobank's curves gave way to straight and narrow roads as foot traffic gave way to horse-drawn carriages. The straightened stretch of road this tour is advancing down had lost its curves long before the railroad arrived in 1847. However, the railroad would change the road's identity yet again, as it split the Succobank in two, allowing the straight stretch we stand upon to acquire a sense of independence. No longer did it seem that Pleasantville was an outgrowth of the Succobank. Instead, the Succobank, or the newly christened Railroad Way, was now the spine of the village, with desired destinations at both ends.
After crossing Sutton Place, The Haight-Sutton House will come into view directly across the street at 254 Bedford Road. As this historic home comes into view, here's our next passage. Haight-Sutton House. This house was the first residence and office constructed in Pleasantville, originally belonging to Dr. Caleb Haight. It was built in about 1848 in the Greek Revival style and enlarged in 1872 with Victorian trim. It was sometimes mistaken for a country inn because of its pleasing, elongated composition. Haight, born in New York City in 1820, graduated from the New York University in 1846 and was a founder of the Westchester Medical Society. He also was a member of AMA and the New York Medical Society. The property was originally on the Leggett-Clark farm. In 1873, Haight died and his widow inherited the home. Haight's daughter, in later years known as Grandma Sutton, lived here until her death in the early 1940s. She was known to smoke a corncob pipe on the front porch.
Let's continue our walk down Bedford and cross Clark Street and come to the middle of the next block just past the Pleasantville Synagogue. Directly across the street from this imprecise spot once stood Pleasantville's first post office at 200 Bedford Road. To help celebrate Pleasantville's postal milestone, village historian Karsten Johnson recorded the following segment for Pleasantville Community Television in 2012.
It's time to congratulate Pleasantville on its 46th birthday on February 29th. Pleasantville is a leap year child. On that day in 1828, the Postmaster General, John McLean, in Washington, D.C., recognized a post office as being in full service with Henry Romer as postmaster. Deliveries were made from Tarrytown once a week to the general store, which Romer conducted at the bend in the highway from Bedford to Tarrytown at the junction with the highway to White Plains. The junction had been known as Clark's Corners and would be in the imagination of local residents for a long time. Romer had been asked to name the post office. There are various ideas about which name Henry Romer proposed. New York State already had a post office at Clark's Corner over in Ulster County. Another one called Mechanicsville in Saratoga County. And there were many Clarksvilles already named throughout the USA. Come up with something else. Romer had grown up in the neighborhood, and anytime he looked south from Bear Ridge or Bedford Road, he saw hills that he must have thought pleasant, and he called it Pleasantville. The hamlet had one meeting house, a general store, a schoolhouse, and about 25 farmhouses within a 2-mile radius. A letter of one sheet of paper sent to New York City cost 6 cents 30 miles away. Romer was now able to send postage-paid letters and receive and collect from local residents on unpaid posts. Pleasantville was official.
Now let's walk to 169 Bedford Road. We mentioned earlier that the arrival of the railroad shaped modern-day Pleasantville as it drew more people and businesses west, causing the old village to forfeit its stature as Pleasantville's commercial center. Still, two of the old village's most revered buildings would be built shortly after the railroad's completion. The expansive Hayes Hotel, built in 1848, and the First Methodist Episcopal Church, built in 1852, located a block apart, were in the minds of many signature buildings or perhaps monuments that would speak to the character of the village and the people who populated for decades to come. Both buildings are gone, but many of the smaller homes built beside and in between the Great Hotel and impressive church remain as private homes today in the old village. One home that predates both the Hayes Hotel and Methodist Church is the house of Henry Clark, located at 169 Bedford Road. The Clark house sits up on a hill with the house's eastern exposure fully visible to the corner Henry Clark gave his name. In the early 1800s, the small village went by Clark's Corners until Clark's nephew Henry Romer changed it to Pleasantville in 1828. The house boasts an impressive interior, complete with the 3 original fireplaces, mantels, and corner cupboards, which are now more than 200 years old, reads an informal guide to historic homes that describes the house as the second oldest building in the old village. Clark lived in the house until his death in 1848, the very year the expansive Hayes Hotel was raised and 1 year after the railroad arrived. Perhaps Clark might find his corner more familiar today with its practical food marts and gas stations than he would the era of the Hayes Hotel with its big city visitors who arrived by train. Clark's family, which intermarried with other notable Pleasantville families, would occupy the home until about 1900.
Let's now continue our walk to the near corner where Broadway meets Bedford Road. Please pause with us at the corner and glance back at Henry Clark's house, which now looks down at us from above. Now let's turn our gaze across the street to the northeast corner, now occupied by Kraft Pizza, and allow your eyes to travel upward beyond the store to what's long been known as Hayes Hill. Michael Hayes came to the area from the town of Bedford after acquiring a sizable piece of property from the governors of Forfeiture. David Hayes, Michael's brother, would inherit the property after Michael's death in 1799. It was only 4 years earlier, in 1795, that Henry Clark bought his farm. For many citizens of this era, the American Revolution was still a vivid and dark memory of land and family lost. For his part, David Hayes harbored many of his own. In 1990, when a Hayes descendant living in Pleasantville donated the family's papers from colonial times to the Westchester County Historical Society, the New York Times published an article on the Hayes family highlighting the colonial exploits of the Hayes family members. The New York Times wrote, "While David Hayes was serving with the American forces on Long Island in the Revolutionary War, the British burned the Hayes home in Bedford and then burned the entire village. In bed with a newborn infant, Esther Hayes had refused to disclose the whereabouts of a party of patriots attempting to drive a herd of cattle through the British lines to the American camp at White Plains. Servants removed Esther and her infant and hid them in the woods until they could be rescued." The Times article identifies the infant as Benjamin Hayes, a name that reigns large among Pleasantville's early citizens. No local endeavor perhaps signaled a brighter future for Pleasantville in the mid-1800s than the rise of the Hayes Hotel. Built by Benjamin Hayes in 1848, it stood 3 stories high with a pearly white railing that ran the roof's entire perimeter. Henry Clark lived to see his neighbor's enterprise rise through the window of his home's eastern exposure, standing proudly at the very center of the village that once bared Clark's own name. Now, let's continue our tour and cross Bedford Road using the painted crosswalk to the northeast corner, where the proud hotel once stood, and a walk a short distance north on Bedford to the front of Daniel Hayes Hose Company, located at 134 Bedford Road. As we walk, we will share a passage with you to better reveal the age Henry Clark and David Hayes knew well.
Passage: Birth of a Nation. Pleasantville paid a heavy price during the War of Independence. During the American Revolution, Westchester County, New York, suffered more casualties and destruction of property than any other county in the 13 colonies that had declared nationhood in 1776. At the war's conclusion, Westchester County was devastated and nearly depopulated. The reason for the violence and pillage was simply because Pleasantville was in no man's land or neutral ground, with British forces entrenched south in New York City and the Continental Army securing control of the upper Hudson Valley in the Highlands. The absence of law and order led to countless raids where valuable livestock, produce, clothes, bedding, and household equipment were stolen. In many cases, the terrorizing attacks left civilian families begging not to be left naked and without food. End of passage.
We are now standing in front of the Daniel P. Hayes Hose Company, named for Benjamin's grandson. Please note many of the homes just to the north of the Hose Company were once Hayes property that Benjamin sold to different merchants, allowing the village to become more of a commercial destination. As for Daniel's contribution to Pleasantville, here again is an excerpt from the New York Times article. Benjamin Hayes left the Pleasantville farm to his son David, but David had other interests, moving to New York City to become a pharmacist. David sold the property, but later his son Daniel Piexto Hayes, a partner in a successful law firm, began buying back the Hayes land, eventually acquiring 52 acres, including the homestead. Several years later, he had built a new home in Pleasantville and had established himself in the village, as his grandfather Benjamin had. Daniel was the village council, helped sponsor the village library, led the fight to incorporate the village in 1897, and served for 7 years as Pleasantville's second mayor. Daniel Hayes died in 1923, and 3 years later, the old homestead was torn down. That year, the village named a local fire company the Daniel P. Hayes Hose Company for the man they called the patron saint of the village. At that time, one of Daniel's children, a daughter, Mabel, remained in Pleasantville, living on family land. End of passage. Our next stop will be the old village's southwest corner. Please return to the northwest corner, and this time cross to the southwest corner, occupied by the 76 service station, before crossing to the southwest corner, occupied by Don Juan's restaurant. Please be careful crossing and feel free to press your pause button until we reconvene on the southwest corner. We will now continue our walk down Broadway on the west side of the street to the old Methodist Cemetery. As we walk, please notice the row of houses on the west side of Broadway. Most of these residences sprang up just a few years prior to the railroad's arrival, and a number of them house track laborers as boarders during the period of construction. For the first half of the 19th century, the everyday lives of Pleasantville citizens were not dissimilar to those of town dwellers in the furthest reaches of upstate New York. However, whatever doings Pleasantville citizens shared in common with upstate town dwellers would quickly lessen as the railroad arrived and Pleasantville became connected to New York City's bottled-up masses. If measured by the number of lives affected, the railroad's impact on city dwellers surely dwarfed the numbers of people populating Westchester County's small towns and villages. However, for the citizens of many of Westchester's small towns, the impact was sudden and striking. Before 1820, the greater Pleasantville community, then known as Clark's Corners, was largely made up of farmers who would routinely travel to Tarrytown, Sparta, or the Sing Sing docks to sell their produce or take it to New York City by sail or tide-powered sloop. After 1820, the steamboat speeded the journey, reducing the river journey to just under 2 hours, writes a local historian. However, the railroad outfitted Pleasantville with its very own port of entry, accommodating travelers at least 3 times a day to a 70-minute trip to Manhattan. Ironically, as the first train pulled into Pleasantville Station, the old village had never been more alive with activity. The boarding houses, which once housed railroad laborers, soon found new patrons from New York City who visited the small town in search of fresh air as well as opportunity. The Hayes Hotel continued to expand to meet demand, and land speculators seemed to be popping up just about everywhere, including the local abolitionist meeting where Rebecca Pierce, daughter of the esteemed Moses Pierce, is reported to have met Samuel Shapter, an entrepreneur with a dream to create a suburb only 70 minutes from Manhattan. The Old Methodist Cemetery will be the last stop on our tour and should shortly appear on your right. If the cemetery is not yet in view, please press your pause button and re-engage the recording once you are standing alongside it. Few things say the end as well as a cemetery, but in fact, where you're currently standing is in many ways a place of beginnings for Pleasantville, or at least a stone's throw away from a number of them. In 1820, the Methodists would build the village's first church on the plot of land bordering the cemetery from the south, and in 1826, the village's first schoolhouse was built on land across Broadway on the corner of Church Street and Broadway, now occupied by Pleasant Terrace Apartments. Like many of the village's earliest endeavors, 2 of its most pioneer citizens came to play central roles. Whereas the land occupied by the village's first church was purchased from Henry Clark, the village's first school was built on land leased from Benjamin Hayes. The school, a 2-story structure, was later moved to Old Schoolhouse Lane on land purchased from Benjamin Hayes. The original church building was also moved and today sits directly across the street at 115 Broadway, now a private residence. Please set your eyes upon the stone steps that lead up to 115's front door and let your eyes follow the property's stone wall in the direction of Church Street. Do you see another set of stone steps? They are closer to the corner and seem to lead nowhere. These steps once led to one of the old village's most impressive structures. On this corner, in 1854, the Methodists built a new church. Unlike the last, this structure was imposing and stood a great deal wider and higher. What had been a modest corner now harbored what became a proud landmark for many Pleasantville citizens as well as travelers of every kind along Broadway. With its predecessor neatly relocated by its side as a parsonage, the proud structure would stand for nearly 100 years before a blizzard caved in its roof. Along our mile walk today, you passed 4 other houses of worship, each with its own unique history and devoted faithful, each in its own way signaling a welcome to the outside world. Certain stones inside the old Methodist cemetery still bear the Clark name, while the C name can be read throughout the Bank Cemetery located across Broadway, a few hundred feet south of 115 Broadway. The oldest stones are barely readable, but often they tell us the most. They speak to an age before the railroad, when lives and fortunes were made and lost along the Succabunk. Thanks for joining us on the Pleasantville Historic Audio Tour. To return to where our tour began, borrow a page from Isaac C., and let the Succabunk be your guide.
Hello, I'm Lee Meyer. I teach English at Pleasantville High School.
Hello, I'm Peyton Pinkerton. I've lived in Pleasantville for 45 years. My 4 children more or less grew up here. They're all out now. We're empty nesters.
Hi, my name is Eileen Sheldon, and I'm a social studies teacher at Pleasantville High School.
Hi, I'm Ira Promisel. I am a professor of criminal justice at St. Thomas Aquinas College and the Scoutmaster of Troop 12 Pleasantville.
Hello, this is Greg Fondy. I am the assistant principal of Pleasantville High School.
And hello again, this is Connor Sweeney. I would like to thank all of our narrators for volunteering their time and helping me complete this tour, and give a special thanks to my Eagle Project sponsor, Mayor Peter Scheer, my Eagle Project coach, Carmel Promsel, and a village historian, Karsten Johnson. And give additional thanks to the Mount Pleasant Library for providing a wonderful selection of history books and useful information, and Pleasantville Community Television for providing useful content and advice. This project has relied on a variety of sources, including the following texts. Pleasantville, 300 Years from Manor to Suburb, by Dennis Corcoran, S. Martin Friedman, and Karsten Johnson. Pleasantville, Throughout the Years, An Informal Guide to the Village's Historic Homes and Buildings, by Carrie Lopez. Images of America, Pleasantville, by Bert Ruiz. Images of America, Mount Pleasant, by George Waterbury, Claudine Waterbury, and Bert Ruiz. Westchester County, A Pictorial History, by Susan Cochran, Swanson, and Elizabeth Fuller. Passages highlighting homes at specific street addresses have been sourced from Pleasantville Throughout the Years, An Informal Guide to the Village's Historic Homes and Buildings. Other historic passages have been sourced from Pleasantville, 300 Years from Manor to Suburb, Images of America, Pleasantville, and Images of America, Mount Pleasant. And all original audio content was recorded with Audacity. As your guide, I claim responsibility for this content and regret any historical inaccuracies. Thanks again for joining us on this historical walk through Pleasantville.